Hello everyone. Welcome to yet another episode of our Express with E segment on VUTV by Vijay Bhumi. It's a special weekly episodic segment where we discuss about topics of great importance and that require immediate attention with students. Today being no different, we have been joined by three students of DPIS International School, Hans, Armia, Drawn. Thank you guys for joining us for today's discussion. We are glad to welcome you for today's panel discussion. Thank you guys for joining us. So today we are going to discuss on an important topic which has been in debate since quite a few times, since quite older days, prostitution. Prostitution, the world's oldest job, continues to exist despite bans on its legal status. It usually occurs because of issues such as poverty or unforeseen circumstances. In a country, prostitution is not illegal in and of itself, but soliciting and public protection are. What about the rights of the individuals engaging in prostitution? How do we put an end to this unwrongful discrimination? Today we are going to discuss about all these topics and all these questions by our panelists. We will be welcoming your perspective, we will be welcoming your answers, and we will be welcoming your perspective around this topic and how do you see and how we can together fight with this evil. The viewers who are watching us, they can put down the questions, and we would love to take up the questions at the end of the discussion. All the people who are watching in our social media, they can also drop their questions, and we would love to take the questions. Thank you guys. Stay tuned for today's discussion. Let's start this. So, starting with the first thing, I would ask to Hans, what is the extent of prostitution which is legal in India? Hans?
Right. So essentially, prostitution in India is technically legal insofar as the act of offering sexual favors in exchange for financial benefit is not illegal within the Indian Penal Code and within the Indian justice system. However, I say technically because, as you've already mentioned in your introduction, there's a lot of strings attached to prostitution. So although the act itself isn't illegal, what certainly is illegal is having brothels, having red light districts, pimping, soliciting prostitutes, publicly publishing phone numbers of call prostitutes, and so on and so forth, right? And of course, child prostitution and human trafficking are obviously illegal, as they should be. In addition to that, the history of prostitution in India is rather complicated insofar as legalization is concerned, because although we've already covered how a lot of add-ons to prostitution, such as having brothels or red light districts, are technically illegal, they are de jure illegal, de facto they still exist. And so prostitution as a whole seems to exist in a sort of legal gray zone as far as the Indian Penal Code is concerned.
Certainly, I guess you have rightly summarized. As you mentioned, the prostitution is quite legal in India, but the number of related activities regarding prostitution, like soliciting, curb crawling, or managing a brothel, or prostitution in hotel, or child prostitution, which we can see in a right amount of crimes happening during child prostitution. We can see women trafficking. All these things are quite illegal, and the pimping and pandering of these activities is also illegal. So going ahead with this thing, is the legalization is this affect or provoke the crimes? Like, what are the perspective? What is the perspective around this? John, we want to ask you, do you think this legalization of prostitution affecting or provoking crimes around human trafficking or sex trafficking?
Thank you so much, first of all, for having me on this panel. Let's start by this. According to suggestions of various researchers carried out globally, it can be estimated that around 10 million children are engaged in prostitution worldwide. And while it is banned in India, it is important to note all of this. Child prostitution still exists in all these countries, irrespective of their level of economic development. And especially if you were to focus on countries like Asia and South America. And there are over 2.5 million sex workers in India, and a quarter of them are still minors. This is despite the law, of course. Child prostitution is one of the main issues that our country faces today, and I would like to term it as one of the hidden tigers that society still doesn't seem to address. Now, in terms of crime, I do believe that the legalization of prostitution is will be more beneficial for society rather than doing more harm to it. With legal and easier alternatives available, people who wish to satisfy their sexual urges will be able to resort to prostitutes rather than committing heinous crimes such as rapes or for the same purpose. If you were to take an example, go out of India, for example, in 1959, Queensland experienced a 149% increase in rate of rape when legal prostitution was banned. And you can continue to point that in India, if prostitution in India accounts for an $8.4 billion industry. And so the legalization of this means that they'll come into the formal economy, which will of course mean that the tax revenue which can be gained from this can be used to deal not only with crimes that are committed in with reference to prostitution in India, but for all other fields too.
Great. I guess you've quite summarized this thing, and the perspective you laid down about how we can formally collect formally collect the taxes around it, and how we can use the divert the taxes in the favor of the victims who are who are basically whose lives are ruined because of the crimes happening around it. Let's come to Hansh, because I see he has raised up his hand and he has a different perspective to share.
So by and large, I don't agree with, I don't disagree with Dron's perspective. I just like to state one thing at the get-go. One of the big issues with talking about prostitution is the fact that because prostitution is so heavily stigmatized in the status quo, it's often hard to get accurate statistics. So online, I've seen the statistics with Dron quoted, 2.5 million sex workers in India, 25% of whom are children. But then again, I've also seen other statistics, both of which are from reputable sources, saying there are as many as 3 million sex workers.
3 million sources, yes.
40% are. Yeah, and so there's an issue with sources in general that I'd like to just highlight going into this discussion. I think it is true that legalized prostitution in India does drive crime. That's not because prostitution is legalized. Rather, it's because prostitution is unregulated. So, like I said, right, because prostitution in India occupies a legal gray zone, India is seeing all the harms of having prostitution be largely illegal and stigmatized without getting the benefits of legalized prostitution. Because when you don't regulate prostitution, when prostitutes don't have access to, say, state-sponsored STD testing, when prostitutes don't have access to, say, labor laws, then even if your prostitution is legal, it's still incredibly easy for prostitutes to become coerced into situations of extreme harm, ranging from child trafficking to sexual assault, and so on and so forth. So it's rather like this half-baked legalization in India that's a cause of a lot of the crimes surrounding prostitution. But by and large, I agree with Dron insofar as if we were to properly regulate and legalize prostitution, we'd probably see the rates of sex-related offenses decrease.
Great, Hans. I guess you've quite insignificantly highlighted how how it's basically as I could understand from both of your perspectives, is that the legalization will certainly provoke or can stop, rather provoking, it will rather stop the crimes. And the problem lies behind the unregulation, like how it's unregulated, and going ahead with, if we can get access to the prostitutes can get access to the labor laws, and they can basically assess the court facilities, and they can urge this facility. So that would be a great thing. It's glad to have a women panelist in today's panel discussion. Armia, welcome, Armia. So we want to know your perspective. Like, what is the perspective around this thing? Do you think the legalization is affecting rather supporting, or is in the favor of the prostitutes? Basically, it's working against them, affecting and provoking different sort of crimes.
I think I agree with both Dron and Hans that legalization would actually do the opposite. It would work more towards protecting the rights of sex workers. And I think a good example of that would be when we see it in relation to violence that sex workers face. For example, in a 1999 study of worldwide sex workers, out of a study of 240 sex workers, half of the ones that worked outside of legal areas faced violence, compared to only a quarter of those who faced violence when they were working in legal areas. And I think it also has a lot to do with the fact that when sex workers realize the fact that their work is being considered illegal or immoral, they're also a lot more likely to be reluctant to report the crimes that they face, since as documented, it would be easier for the police to extort bribes from them or coerce them or harass them, because the work itself is seen as illegal.
Nice point, Soumya. I see Ron has raised his hands. Do you want to add something, Ron?
Yes, I do want to add something. Two things actually. Number one is that if you were to look at the flip side of the coin, while I personally do believe, like all the other two panelists, that the legalization of prostitution will be more beneficial to us. Um, I do think that it's important to investigate the flip side of the coin too. It is like, for example, if you were to look under prostitution, there is still trafficking. There is still, the people who are involved with illegal prostitution are still people who are in power and with significant, finances. So, um, even if we were to legalize, even if the government were to legalize prostitution, there's nothing to really say that a black market of sorts cannot and will not develop. And b as Hans rightly mentioned, the stigma in society against prostitution will still remain. So even if it is a legal activity to be a sex worker, people will still view them the same way that they view them right now, which will still lead to their social exclusion, which is nothing short of a crime.
Certainly, I guess you have highlighted some good points, and like the stigmatization of the sex workers, like it makes their lives quite horrible. Like as you mentioned about the exclusion from the society, it makes their lives quite horrible, and they are devoid of the public facilities such as the washrooms and the public places where they should visit. And people basically see them in a different tone and like they behave quite differently with them. Uh, Moving ahead, like I see Armia and Hans has
Maybe as it has been seen worldwide, not in India yet, but legalization could actually help eliminate the process of the managers of the brothels or the pimps or the middlemen, because when prostitution is not legalized, like properly legalized, not just by the Nordic model, what happens is that due to the sex workers not having the usual worker benefits, they're also not able to exercise their rights, such as opening their own bank accounts for their own business. So, as to say, they're not really able to protect their own rights. So, I think with legalization, the sex workers would be able to own their work for themselves, and that could eliminate the risk of, say, middlemen or pimps who use them for their own financial benefits.
certainly Armia. I guess you rightly said like if it's if the legalization and the regulation properly happens in the case of prostitution, then probably there will be the elimination of the pimps. There will be elimination of the pimps, and as you mentioned about the people who manages the brothel, so they can own the like they can be independently owning their financial, and they can what I can say, they can avoid the crisis of hampered by the being hampered or tortured by the pimps, I can say. Hans, yeah, do you have something to add on?
Yes, broadly two things. The first one is that the key with legalization in terms of removing middlemen and managers and whatnot is that it gives, how do I say this? It gives prostitutes or individual sex workers the agency to be able to, as I may have stated, conduct financial transactions and set up businesses on their own. And we're already seeing a bit of this under like India's legally grey system. So for example, you have the Usha Multipurpose Cooperative Society Limited, which has been like providing financial services to sex workers throughout the pandemic and so on and so forth. But of course, this could be greatly expanded with like a proper regulation of legalized prostitution. The second thing, regarding what Dhron said about stigma, I think that although stigma will certainly exist, I do think that Indian society's stigma against prostitution, although still rather significant, is less than many other more puritanical societies, insofar as India in specific has had like a rather long history of prostitution being a job. And B, I think especially in countries like India and developing countries in general, where lots of people respect authority, specifically the authority of the state, legalization of prostitution could very well serve as an engine for driving change in the mindset of people and the way they view prostitution. Because when you sign a law saying that prostitution shall be legalized, saying that prostitution shall be regulated, that's when you're sending out a signal as a state that, okay, this thing is okay and we can regulate it just like any other industry. And so you sort of like begin the gradual process of wearing down stigma once you start legalizing.
Great points, Hans. I just wanted to ask, like, there was this question quite floating in the social media, and I got this opportunity to ask you guys as a panelists. So this is an open question to the panel. We can start with Drone with his views. prostitution in India is quite legal. Like as you mentioned, the prostitution is legal, but it's unregulated, as we discussed before. But when we see people quite get aggressive on the cases of rape. Like we have seen a lot of cases, a lot of incidents where people get aggressive in the cases of rape or molestation against girls. But they see or they take it casually when they get to hear that prostitution in India is legal. So, what is your take on this? Like, are people being hypocrites? Like, they have like for a certain kind of behavior, they're considering it's good, but for an extent of it, they are being liberal. So, Drone, we can start with you, then followed by Hans.
There are a lot of points which contribute to society remaining neutral about prostitution, but remaining very aggressive about rape, and especially in India. Broadly, I would like to mention 2 points. One is the lack of information. So, if you were to look at newspapers, if you were to look at televisions, radios, etc., the the number of times and number of articles with reference to rape that is happening in every day with young women, with girls, etc., is much more in the media spotlight than the crimes that are that are getting committed against the whole
Yeah.
prostitution industry and against sex workers. Um, so therefore, people lack the awareness and the information about what is happening in this industry. Now, if you were to go and ask someone, do you know if prostitution is legal in India? 9 out of 10 times, I do expect that the person will have no idea of what law is there. They won't have any idea about the ITPA. They won't have any idea about the CETA Act that was passed in 1956. And so it comes down to basic lack of awareness and basic lack of media spotlight. In addition to that, of course, there are those who are involved in the industry, and as I mentioned before, not have the courage to speak up, because again, as I said, people who rule or run these industries are people in power and people with significant financial aid. And so anyone raising their voice not only threatens their livelihood, their occupation, but also their lives. So yeah.
Certainly, I guess you rightly pointed out the fact that people are lacking the information. And one point, another point we can also rightly say ki, most of the people doesn't know what are these laws are. Like as you mentioned, ki, prostitution is legal in India, but the related activities around prostitution, that's about managing a brothel or prostitution in hotel, child prostitution, are illegal, and people can report these crimes. These are like often there are like criminal offenses, and people can raise up these issues in the court. So probably there is a lack of information, and there needs to be a awareness drive around it so that people get aware about it. Moving ahead with Hans, yeah, I guess Hans, do you want to add something?
Yes, so I somewhat disagree with Drone actually, but not too much really, but not a fundamental disagreement, but a slight disagreement in the way the question was framed. So essentially, I think that it is entirely correct and acceptable for society to become outraged about sexual assault, but I don't think it is acceptable for society to become outraged over sex work, because the two are fundamentally different things and aren't even in the same magnitude in terms of harm or like moral choice that is being invoked. Please indulge me for a second. I'd like to embark on a thought experiment, right? If you were the victim of aggravated sexual assault, let's say you were raped, right? You were fundamentally violated in the most heinous way possible. Your private parts were assaulted, you were sodomized or whatever, against your will, against your consent. No one asked you to do it. You didn't make a choice. Oftentimes, physical coercion was involved, i.e., literally holding you down and then assaulting you in order to do it, right? And so fundamentally, that is a heinous act, which is quite horrible, right? And people are rightfully feel rightfully disgusted by it. On the other hand, in terms of sex work, if a sex worker chooses to engage in sexual activity with a client in exchange for financial benefit, that is an active choice that has been made by both parties. A transaction has occurred. And so given that coercion isn't occurring and the factor of consent is already there, I fail to see what exactly the outrage is about. It's a perfectly normal transaction. Of course, if a sex worker has been trafficked, or if a sex worker is doing it against his or her will, that is the point at which there is coercion. And so it no longer becomes sex work, it becomes sexual assault, and thus falls under rape and all like the associated moral outrage.
Great, Hans. I guess you have shared a different perspective, and that was also quite right on your part. Like as you mentioned, if there is something happening on the interest of the both the parties, and there is a transaction happening around it, so it's a will of the two both the people, both the parties to enter for a choice. But certainly, as Don mentioned, the ill effects happening, like as you mentioned, if it's happening against the will, or there is something called trafficking happening, so people should raise voice around it. Armia, what is your take on this? Like we have seen different perspective around this matter. What is your take
I
on this?
wanted to continue from the last thing that Hans mentioned about if there is still trafficking or violence against a sex worker, then even that should be brought to one's awareness. And I think in Indian society, it's significant to note the disparity between the reactions of a normal rape case that you would hear about and an assault case against a sex worker. Because I think a major thing in Indian society that hovers above our heads is the concept of honor. So when one talks about rape, they talk about how the person's honor has been violated. But when they see the same rape or assault happening with a sex worker, the reaction is not as violent or aggressive, maybe because due to the stigma, because they already feel that if a person is involved in sex work, they are already not having the same level of dignity or not having the same level of honor. So I think the difference between the reactions compared to a normal rape case and a rape case against a sex worker also stems from the very stigma that Indian society still holds.
Certainly, I guess you have highlighted the right points, Armia. But as you guys mentioned, the stigma, like we have in the discussion talked about the stigma, like how society holds a different stigma for the sex workers and how they're excluded from, as Ron mentioned earlier, how they're excluded from the social facilities. Like as students, what would be your take on this? Like how we can prevent this thing? Like how we can bring a change? Like if you want to, like if you are given a chance, like if you are given a chance, like what are the steps you can take on, and how you can initiate a change for this cause? Hans, we can start with you.
So of course, as with like all other social causes and as with all other policy changes that you would like to bring about to presumably achieve a sort of better utilitarian means for society as a whole and a certain target group of people, functions on two planes basically. The first one socially, second one legislatively. So on the social aspect, what you'd essentially have to do is you'd have to raise awareness, as Drone has already pointed out on numerous times before this. You need to talk to people, you need to tell them that, well, you need to show them more or less through various mediums. You could show it through print, through writing, through film, by literally getting them to talk to sex workers and so on and so forth. Show them that really there shouldn't be that much stigma hung onto this profession, right? Because like only when we remove the stigma can we actually like solve the worst excesses that are associated with this profession. And so that's the first tangent on which you need to solve this issue by changing people's mindsets around it. The second way is legislatively, where you campaign for legislative reform, where you say, okay, great, we have legalized prostitution now. Let's also introduce proper regulation within prostitution. Let's say properly legalize soliciting. Let's legalize publishing phone numbers, so on and so forth, so that we can bring the profession of sex work out of the shadows, out of the darkness, into the open, where it can be better overseen by the law and where everyone involved can be like better safeguarded and we can prevent harm from occurring. And of course, both of these feed into each other, right? As I've earlier mentioned, legislative change tends to influence people's mindsets. And obviously, when people's mindsets change, that is when they're more likely to campaign for legislative change. That's when they're more likely to protest. That's when they're more likely to write letters to their representatives. That's when they're more likely to vote for people who would wish to like make change happen within the sex work industry, and so on and so forth.
Great, Hans. I guess that were some great points you shared. And as you mentioned about the legislative points, yeah, if we could rightly associate and work on the strictly following the rights of the prostitutes, then we can certainly make a change on the in the side. Moving ahead with Trump, like what are your take on this? Like how we can improve the stigma, like how we can work against the stigma of the breaking the stigma of for the sex workers.
I do completely agree with the 2 points that Hans has mentioned with the society level and the legislation by the government. I do believe that as the upcoming generation of this nation, it is important for us to not only spread this into society and well, governments working towards getting the proper legislation towards it, but also I do think it's important for us to permeate the ideologies into our own family. So if you were to take, like, let's say the LGBTQIA plus society, um, there was a time where all families, the older generation of the families would still be against the whole concept of transgenders, bisexuals, etc., etc., etc. Now, through over time and over generations, people have come to realize that it's completely normal to be gay, to be lesbian, etc. Same applies for the prostitute industry and for sex workers. It is important for us. It is our generational responsibility for us. And while that might sound too righteous, it is important for us to not only permeate this into the society, our societies, but also to our own families, so that we have the backing of our own people, so that when we grow up, it is not only us that are trying to propagate this message, but our families collectively spreading it towards their own circles, which would eventually act as a catalyst to this problem, to solve this problem.
That's great, Ron. I guess you have highlighted like these are like some of the upbringing values and the upbringing what I can say are while we during the upbringing process there were some of the thoughts, there were some of the ideals which we had as you mentioned about talking about the transgender, and right now we also see there is a huge topic and there is a huge sometimes there are debates happening around LGBTQI community, even the status which they observe, which they deserve, sorry, the status which they deserve, they are not getting that status grounded. And the same happening with the sex workers and the prostitutes as well. So, guys, do you think around this thing, if you see in around this line, key, the children's lives, the women's lives, there have been cases reported where the children are trafficked and they have been used for child begging. Okay, and the women are used for sex trafficking and human trafficking cross-border nations, like cross-border nations and cross-border states. So basically, these are the viewing. Like if you talk about the students are the change makers of the future. They are the future change makers. Okay, and if a lot of students are, if a lot of children are reading, like basically, if their life is unique because of this heinous crimes, how we can have a stop to this? How we can have a stop to this? But also, I would like to know your views, like how we can regulate the flesh trade, how we can regulate the flesh trade, and how, like any ideas you have, any suggestions, or any basically, if you have some anecdotes from other nations that we can also implement in the case of India, and we can boycott this and we can fight against this. Yeah, Hans, we can start with you.
Yes, so essentially the way in which regulation works operates on two key levels. The first one is regarding human trafficking, particularly child trafficking. The second one is regarding ensuring safety and security for consensual adult sex work. The first part, which is obvious, which is human trafficking, basically people being coerced into the sex trade against their will, oftentimes children, oftentimes vulnerable individuals from places of financial hardship who have been coerced into this. That is obviously already illegal. It should be illegal. The problem with it is, though, although laws around it exist already in India and, well, really all over the world, the problem is, especially in developing countries like India, endemic corruption and government inefficiency make it very, very hard to enforce those said laws. So in theory, adult victims of human trafficking are entitled to a grant of 10,000 rupees, and minor victims of human trafficking are entitled to a grant of 20,000 rupees and then further education. But the problem is, because of endemic corruption, because of mid-level government official siphoning of funds, what often happens is victims don't get full compensation. Oftentimes the police take bribes. Oftentimes the police themselves are involved in the trafficking. And oftentimes once you do get out of the system of this heinous system of trafficking, once you do get to like your shelters, it's often of like a really, really poor quality accommodation simply because the budget either isn't there or has literally been stolen, right? And the second aspect of it, which is regulating the adult sex trade, again, is the same thing, right? Ensuring STD treatment, ensuring good labor regulations, ensuring good facilities, public facilities, so on and so forth, right? We can have legislative change around all of that. And certainly we see many countries ranging from the Netherlands to Australia to New Zealand successfully enforcing regulatory policies. The only problem is all those countries which have successfully legalized and regulated sex trade are developed countries with stable, relatively transparent, corruption-free governments, and a good amount of resources proportional to population levels. Unfortunately, as I've already said, India is a developing country. We suffer from the endemic problems of developing countries: corruption, inefficiency, so on and so forth. And so, while we can certainly talk about like legislative regulation, it might be difficult to enforce that relevant regulation unless and until, over the course of time, the country as a whole develops economically.
Great, Hans. I guess you have highlighted one of the anecdote, and also moving ahead, like I want to also highlight this anecdote of the case of Bosnia. As you mentioned, in the case of Bosnia, that when there was a organized sex trade was going on, the whole system was involved in it. The cops, the army people, they were also involved in the sex trade, and there was some. I guess there have to be some strong legal rules against this officials, the people who are basically we can say that they are the peacekeepers for the nation. If they also try in case of bribery, in case of having a greed for money, if they also involved in the position for sex trade, then that's a quite miserable condition. So there should be strong legalizations and regulations around this thing. Armia, what is your take on this? Like how we can regulate the flesh trade, and how we can save the people, the lives of the children whose lives are ruining because of human and sex trafficking.
I think I majorly agree with what Hans said, because even though obviously the statistics, the figures would dwindle, they're not entirely reliable. But for example, in 2009 in India, around 1.2 million children were involved in the flesh trade. So now, when we talk about it theoretically, of course, legalizing of sex work would put the minors in a position where they can be recognized in the same category as other victims of child labor. So then the authorities can have the minors removed from those trades, and their rights can be protected as they are for, say, other victims of child labor in other industries. But then, as Hans mentioned, it all comes down to the actual state of the country and the conditions, because even today, not just in the sex industry, in other industries, steel, iron, making firecrackers, there are so many industries where child labor is so actively used, and the police are aware of it, the authorities are aware of it, and it's in the laws, but their rights are not protected because of, say, issues like corruption. So even if there are legislative changes, I think it boils down to the implementation by the authorities, which unfortunately in India hasn't been observed as too reliable for minors and women.
Certainly, I guess you have highlighted, like once we are sorted with the conditions of the nation, like as you mentioned, the developed nations have a perk, like they have an edge over it regarding the legalization and the regulation. And the cases of India is quite different. Sorry for giving you waiting, John. You can just share your idea points.
Oh no, I was unmuting myself, so that's fine. I do want to mention that expanding on what Hans said, in terms of legal legislation, I do believe that we already have some preliminary form of groundwork already set. Now, with the ITPA, which we have drafted so many years ago, say after 1986, that law has not changed. And so, considering that we were still a closed economy before 1991, and there has been no change to that law since 1986, mainly, I do believe that improving that law itself goes a long way in helping child trafficking. So, helping reducing child trafficking. Sorry. As Alvin already mentioned, the 1.2 million figure, while most figures are not what is not trusted, you can trust this figure because it has been given by the CBI, and so a 1.2 million figure, 1.2 million children is a significant amount of children who are involved in this, and so they are involved in commercial sex, involuntary domestic servitude, forced child labor, child soldiers, and numerous other illegal activities. So the improving of this law itself, for which we already have the groundwork set, will go a long way in helping reduce the problem of flesh trade.
Great. Yeah, Armia, I see you raising up your hand. Do you
I
want to
think
add
there's
something?
also an issue with the fact that a lot of the times in India, sex work and trafficking are placed synonymous with each other. And I think that starts from the very fact that the 1956 law was named, which the principal legislation which deals with all amount of work related to prostitution. It was called Suppression of Immoral Traffic Act. And then in 1965, the act was called Immoral Traffic Prevention Act. So I think starting from the very name itself, they're putting sex work and trafficking in the same category, which also prevents then removal of minors from sex work. Because then these are the very laws that are not too beneficial and, as Drone mentioned, outdated as well. So I think there needs to be a proper disparity, a proper separation, recognizing consensual sex work and the issues with trafficking, child trafficking.
I guess you guys have rightly pointed out we should be having some more strict legislation around for the minors, and there should be, like as you mentioned, there is a synonymous between the immoral trafficking and the sex work. So basically, there should be a separation around it, and there should be strict legal legislation for the minors as well. Hans, yeah, do you want to add something?
Yes. So like the fundamental issue, as Drone has already pointed out, around the Immoral Traffic Suppression Act is essentially that it's not been amended since 1986, right? In 1986 in India, we didn't have a proper market economy. Gay and other LGBTQAI plus people didn't really have rights. We were in many ways quite underdeveloped compared to where we are today. We weren't a major world economy. We weren't an emerging market. We didn't even have nuclear power at that time. And so it's a very anachronistic law that hasn't moved forward in the 35 plus odd years since it was last amended. And then moving on to what Armia said about the clubbing together of trafficking and sex work. Further thing on that, the word immoral within the relevant legal phrasing itself adds credence to the idea that the act of transactional sex is literally the same as trafficking, right? When you label all forms of sex work as immoral and you shove them under a blanket law, what you do is you further stigma in society, which both hinders social change and legislative change. So while yes, maybe we could amend the relevant laws and through that achieve safe regulation of the sex industry, maybe we might just have to repeal the concerned sections of the Indian justice of the legal and penal codes and then replace them with new laws.
Certainly, I guess amendation of the laws can also work best in the favor of the prostitutes and the sex workers. Thank you guys. It was a quite fruitful discussion and an insightful discussion from here, and it was nice to see you guys having strong facts and a strong perspective around all the cases. And that's the objective of UTV, which we are trying to promote the students, and we want your perspective and the views around the current topics and the topics which require immediate attention. Because as the students like us, we are the change makers, and we should work in the favor of the nation. And how we should have a good perspective, good vision. Like these are the social evils and these are the social crimes happening in our society, and we should have a good perspective, and we should have a mindset that how we can bring a change to society. I guess that's the thing we are working on. Thanks guys for joining for today's discussion. It was quite fruitful. It was a good discussion, and there were some good points as you guys mentioned about yet there is a legalization in legalization of prostitution in India, but due to the unregulation and due to being an unregulated industry, the crimes are happening. The crimes of human trafficking, sex trafficking are happening, and bringing on strict legislation rules for the minors, we can have a good, we can hope for a good change. Thank you guys for joining in. The viewers who are watching us, hope you had a great take. Hope you had some good takeaways from this discussion. Stay tuned for the next discussion. Thank you guys for joining. See you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Great guys. Thank you.